Hey, my name is AJ. I'm a designer from Toronto, and I'm going to walk you through my process of designing this poster. Okay, so the first thing I'm doing is laying out a grid system or guides for the poster. So guides are helpful in poster design because they provide structure and organization to the layout. The purpose of the guides are to help establish consistent alignment and proportions, which helps create a visually cohesive and balanced design. So I'm doing this to make sure that all elements on the poster are positioned harmoniously, and it'll make it easier for viewers to navigate and understand the information presented. So I like to embrace unconventionality in my designs wherever possible, and so I decided to make a creative choice by placing the grid system on a slight angle. Next, I'm just laying out the important and mandatory information that is necessary to appear on the poster, such as the name of the event, the location, the date, and then I'm just figuring out exactly how I want the important information to be displayed on the poster. Once I'm happy with the placement of the information, I go ahead and bring in my first image. So obviously, since this is a Groundhog Day event, I decided to use Midjourney to generate a picture of a groundhog, and obviously since this is supposed to be like a rave sort of dance party event, I wanted the groundhog to have some glasses and some headphones, so I made sure to include that in the prompt when I generated the image. And after a few attempts at generating the image, this is the one I was most happy with. So now I'm just removing the background from this image. I wanted the groundhog to appear as if it was popping out of a hole, but the image didn't generate that. So I generated another image of a groundhog, making sure that that image included dirt. And so I'm just going ahead and cutting out the dirt from this image, and I'm just going to combine it with the next one. So I'm just using my marquee tool here to make this selection. And then I'm using a layer mask and a brush to just get rid of the parts of the image that I don't want. Once I was happy with the way that the dirt looked, I just went ahead and spliced the two images together. And then I'm just going ahead and bringing in the rest of the images that I collected that I want to include on the poster. So I have this image of this handler from the Groundhog Day event in Pennsylvania holding a groundhog. I definitely wanted to include that. And since this event is an outdoor event in February and it's in Toronto, it's obviously wintertime here and it's snowing. So I also wanted to include images of people wearing snowsuit outfits as well. And the next image that I'm bringing in is actually the gates at the front entrance of the park. So I didn't want anything in the background. You can see the trees and the people walking in the back. I didn't want to include that. So I'm just doing some work to remove all of those parts. So the first thing I tried to do is I tried to select all of the green in the image, but that didn't really work out the way that I had hoped. So then the next thing I attempted to do was I actually tried to cut out each individual space between the iron bars. And I quickly realized that this was going to take forever and it's not really a practical way of doing things. I went ahead and just made the selection of the actual pillars of the gates and I just cut out the rest. I just found a picture of a gate online with a white background. I made sure that I had a white background so that the background is just really easy to remove. All I have to do is select the white of the image. And then I basically just removed the background from the image of the gate. And then I spliced the image of the new gate with the original image of the park gates. I only decided to do the one side of the gate so I can copy, paste it, and flip it to the other side so that I don't have to do the exact same work twice. So as you can see here, it looks pretty identical to the original image, which I'm happy about. And then I just decided to do some final touch-ups on the gate. I decided to remove any parts that didn't belong, such as this wire here. And then I also wanted to make sure I was getting the details. So I just decided to take the plaque from the original image of the gates and just paste it on the new image that I created. So now that I have all of the main images and elements that I want to include on the design, I decided to go ahead and play out with the layout a little bit more. Eventually, I decided to settle on one layout and come back to it later. I still want to edit the images a lot more and find the right typefaces to use, so I just decided to move on and come back to the layout later. So the first image I decide to edit is the picture of the handler. So I start off by adding a threshold adjustment layer, and then I also add a dithering layer below it. If you've never heard of dithering before, the easiest way to describe it is that it helps smooth out the transition between the colors. So it's like blending the colors softly so that they look more natural and less choppy. You can see that before I add the dithering layer, there's almost no smooth transition between the black and the white. It's very much like a hard cut. And so what dithering does is that it blends it out a little bit more. So there's much more of a smoother transition between the white and the black areas. So I'm just playing around with the threshold layer to see if I can get it to a point where I'm happy, but I'm struggling a little bit. So I decide to play around with the colors and the levels of the base layer. And how I do that is I add a hue saturation layer below the dithering layer, and I just play around with the colors until I get a little bit more of a smooth transition between the black and the white. Once I get the hue saturation adjustment to a level I'm happy with, I just go ahead and play around with the layer mask on the hue saturation layer in order to get the detail of the image to a level that I'm happy with. I also then went ahead and created a separate threshold layer for specific parts of the image, and I just cut out the rest of the parts that I don't need. So eventually I decide that the threshold and the dithering is just not really working the way that I want it to. So I decide to bring parts of the original image back. I turn the overall image black and white, and I just included parts of the threshold that I wanted to. So as you can see, I barely applied any threshold to the face of the man and the face of the beaver, but you can see the threshold applied a lot, especially in the man's suit, in the light areas, and the hat as well. Once I was happy with the threshold adjustment, I decided to add a slight halftone texture on top of the image as well. After that, I just went ahead and applied pretty much the same treatment to all of the images. So next I decided to work on the actual logo of the name for the event. So I'm doing this in Illustrator, and then I'm using the warp effect to get it into a way that looks cool but is still very much legible. So I kind of want to go with this wave effect. One thing I actually love doing when experimenting with the warps in Illustrator is I like to actually stack them to get just completely wacky and different results. So that's basically just what I'm doing here. Once I was happy with the warping of the letters, I turned the letters into an outline, and then I just went ahead and printed this. Once the logo is printed, I decide to use a permanent black marker to color it in, and then I just go ahead and I scan it back into my computer. In all honesty, that part was kind of useless because my intentions were to make the logo appear as if I actually hand wrote it and scanned it in, but then I just end up editing it to a point where it doesn't even look like it was handwritten and scanned in. I pretty much black out the entire logo so that it just looks like it was generated either in the Illustrator or in Photoshop anyways. Now that I have the actual logo created, I go ahead and play around with the layout of all of the elements again until I get it to a point where it looks okay, but this isn't the final layout. It does change once more later on. So the next thing I'm doing is I'm adding some more adjustments to the logo. So I decide to add a drop shadow and a stroke around it. And then I end up bringing in one more image that I want to use, which is an image of a disco ball. So I just bring that in and I cut it out, and I apply the same threshold treatment that I did to the other images to the disco ball as well. So I decide to adjust the levels of the black and white for each of the images because they are very much on different levels. So I just wanted to make them a little bit more consistent and cohesive with each other. So I'm making certain images darker and then certain images lighter. And then I move on to adding some layer styles to the images. So just like I did with the logo, I end up adding a drop shadow to the images as well as a stroke. So for the strokes, one of my favorite ways of applying strokes to basically anything is to apply a triple stroke. So what I do is I apply a thin black stroke, and then I apply a white stroke that is just slightly bigger than the first black stroke, and then I apply another black stroke that is bigger than the white stroke. Now, after applying the strokes to the gates, what I realize is that the image of the gates are actually transparent, so they're just completely blacking out the iron bars. So I just decide to add in some white to the background of the image of the gates to make them appear like they're transparent again. Then once I'm happy with the layer styles, I just go ahead and start adding some color. So I decided to stick to a color palette of 3 colors. So I have this green, this blue, and this red that I originally start using in the image. And I'm just going ahead and coloring in various parts of the image and trying to find the best way that the colors will work well with each other. So after coloring in a bit of the elements, I decide to experiment with the overall color palette a bit more. And I do this by using a hue saturation layer over the entire image. So this is actually one of my favorite ways of experimenting with color palettes. So usually what I'll do is I'll find a color palette on the internet that already works, that I like, and I'll basically just use that color palette in my design, and then I'll go ahead with a hue saturation layer and I'll experiment with the values, so the hue, the saturation, and the lightness, until I get a combination of colors that are different but still looks good. And I love doing it this way because the colors are already relative to each other using the first color palette, so no matter what you set the hue level to, the colors will maintain their relative relationship and they'll always be complementary to each other, so it'll always work. You just have to find a collection of colors that you think looks good for the design. design. So I end up using this color palette of a sort of neon green, pink, and blue, and then I just go ahead and start coloring in the rest of the image as I see fit. So once I'm happy with the color palette, I didn't film it, but I decided to add a texture over the whole poster just to give my eyes some sort of interest while I'm designing. Plus it'll also give me an idea of what the poster will look like once I start adding on more and more texture towards the end of the process. And so next I decide to look for some typefaces for the DJ lineup and the location and date as well. So eventually I set on this font called Gambi, and then I decide to go ahead and add some layer style to it. So again, I'm using the 3-stroke trick that I used on the rest of the images, where I use a thin black stroke, a white stroke, and then another thinner black stroke. And then we come to pretty much the final layout of the poster design. Then I decide I actually want to use a different typeface for the location and the date. So one trick I use for diversifying the font usage is I try to find fonts that are similar in style but are still kind of different. So obviously the typeface in the logo looks handwritten, so that's the same kind of vibe I'm going for when selecting a typeface for the date and time as well. So I eventually come across this handwritten typeface called Weekend Mood, and then I decide I actually want to place some sort of background on the location, date, and time. So I just created this handwritten rectangle and I add a white background and a stroke and drop shadow to it. Next, I just go ahead and make some final adjustments to the overall layout. I get the elements placed properly and I do some final editing. So I decided I want to get rid of the background of the image of the girl wearing the ski mask. So I use a layer mask to cut out the background. Next, I just go ahead and decide to add some more finishing touches and elements. So because this event is a sort of DIY pop-up event, I thought a great way to represent the DIY vibe would be to add some marker doodles and scribbles. So that's basically what I'm just doing here. I decided to add this sort of circle scribble around the date and time, just to sort of draw your attention to it, because that is probably the most important piece of information on the poster is the location, date, and time. And then I decide to add some more scribbles across the rest of the image. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically drawing a face using the same marker doodle image, and then I decide to actually color it green to match the background, and then I just add some eyes to the face. Next, I decided to add a border to the poster. So again, I'm using these scribbles, and these scribbles are actually from Design Syndrome. He has a free pack in his store that includes, I think, around 10 doodle graphics, and I'm using some of those graphics from that pack here. And I don't know what it is, but I feel like borders just really add some sort of completeness to a poster. You'll see that once I add the border, I could pretty much just call it a day after that, and it just looks like a complete poster. Once I'm happy with the border, I move on and I decide to add some more doodles. So the rest of the doodles that I use are actually from Envato Elements. I decide to just basically fill in all of the empty green spaces with doodles. So I'm using these music notes because obviously this is a music/rave event. And as mentioned before, it is outside, it's February, it's winter here in Toronto. So I'm adding some doodles of snowflakes, and then I'm also adding some hearts because one of the main values for the organizers of this event is community. So that really helps represent that. And then this is another one of my favorite parts of the design. I actually found these flag doodles that I think just look so cool because the gates actually do look like they could have flags on top of them, but just to sort of have this mixed media effect of a real image, but then you have these drawn images of flags on top of them, like I think that it looks really cool. Then I just decide to add some doodles of clouds, and then I also add this sort of doodle of an arrow just to sort of show that this is where the event is taking place. So next I decide to add a texture of folded paper, and I swear at this point adding textures of folded paper is like my signature, especially when it comes to like rave flyers and stuff like that. I just think it looks really cool. It makes the poster looks like it was actually printed and then folded up and then scanned back in. And then now we're pretty much just adding in some final textures just to give some more interest to the overall poster design. So I'm just layering a bunch of textures onto the poster. I'm making adjustments to the textures wherever I feel like it needs to be adjusted. And then next I move on to adding a Inkbleed effect. So there's a million ways that you can do the Inkbleed effect, but I just find the most straightforward way is to just create a separate layer and to use your brush tool and use a paint splatter brush, and it really just easily gives the effect. You can play around with the flow and the opacity of the brush to make adjustments to how strong the brush works, but this is probably just the most straightforward way of doing the Inkbleed effect for me. So I'm just pretty much adding it all over the design. So I'm not being being really too careful at all with adding the ink bleed. You can always just use the eraser brush and delete whatever you don't like. So my strategy when it comes to adding the ink bleed effect is the more black there is in one area, that's where you want to put the most ink bleed. So you can see parts of the design where a lot of black is present is where I add more ink bleed versus the parts of the design that don't really have that much black, such as the thin black strokes in certain areas. So once I'm done using my brush tool to apply the ink bleed effect, I actually take it a step further by grouping all of the contents of the poster except the background, and then I'll actually add a layer mask on that group, and I will use the same brush tool that I used for my ink bleed, and then I'll actually start to erase certain parts of the contents so that it looks like those parts didn't even print. And I think that this really takes the ink bleed effect to the next level and makes it look a lot more realistic than just adding additional black to it. So you can really see it especially in the areas of black where the green of the background starts to poke through, and I just think it really makes the ink bleed effect look so much better. And with that, here is the final poster design. Overall, I'm really happy with the way that this design came out. I think that the textures just look great, especially once you zoom in and see them up close, and I'm really happy with the vibrant energy that this poster gives off. If you like this video, consider leaving a like below, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.